The Shaping of Gondor, Part 2, The Line of Meneldil. Chapter 4, Tarannon Falastur. On the morning of 15 Narqueliae, in the year 830, the carillons and the bell towers of Osgiliath began to peal solemnly. Riders on horseback were dispatched to the royal grove of Orome in South Ithilien to bring word to Prince Tarannon, who had departed on a hunting excursion a fortnight earlier, of the death of his father King Siriondil, and to inform him of his accession to the White Throne. Upon receiving these tidings, according to the most well-known tale, Tarannon knelt down in a virginal meadow with an oaken branch and a handful of Gondorian soil, and vowed before the Valar to make his kingdom a monument to their glory. By nearly every measurement he was to succeed. Although he had ever honored him before the people, in truth, the new king held little in common with his sire. Ever contrite before the Valar, Siriondil had, in effect, been a priest upon the throne, and had been concerned with little in the way of royal duties, or the maintenance of the realm. This had gone a long way in weakening the strength and stability which she had known under Romendikil, Turambar, and Antanatar. In following the ship of state and allowing the ship of state to drift so long in his carelessness, Siriondil left Gondor in a worse standing than he found her. Weary of his tedious solemnity and inertia, his people were glad to see him go. Now, however, Tarannon was king, and it was as though Osterher had been succeeded by Romendikil all over again. Admittedly, the new monarch did not have the appearance of a warrior. Wiry and awkward, with an overlarge head, crowned with a tangle of thinning red hair and piercing green eyes, he presented an image of ungainliness which belied his true ability. Though he had been a delicate youth, vigorous training with the Knights of the White Guard and among the forest men of Ithilien had fashioned him into a skilled soldier, deadly with both sword and bow. His greatest strength, though, lay in his forever restless mind. In opposition to his father, Tarannon had scorned the comforts of prayer and solitude in favor of adventure and ranging in the wider realm, and his travels took him as far as the Misty Mountains and the wild lands of Rhûn. But his greatest fascination lay to the west and towards the sea. Tarannon had been but a young man during the great Umbardrum raids of 698 and 740, but he remembered them well, and had actually led the crown force that had relieved the ports of Linhir and Pelargir. During the reign of his father thereafter, he spent much time in the many ports along the Bay of Belfalas, and learned much of the art of shipbuilding and seamanship. Indeed, there is a story that around the year 800, when a great derelict Umbardrum galley was found beached upon the Isle of Tulfalas, Tarannon insisted that it be rebuilt and relaunched in Pelargir. He then rechristened her as Eckmeril, or Jewel of the Sea, and sailed her under Gondorian colors as his flagship for many years henceforth. Up and down the length and breadth of the coasts of Middle-earth the prince had roved. In 810 he made landfall at the mouth of the Gwathlo River and Eriador. In 814 he dropped anchor in Mithlond in Lindon, becoming the first prince of the south to visit that northern kingdom of the elves since Isildur, 8 centuries before. In 816 he made a short visit to Annúminas and was received by the court of King Erendur of Arnor. The southerly regions drew his greatest attention, however. Immediately to the south of Gondor's borders beyond the mouth of the Anduin and north of the river Harnan sat the broad stretch of land and coast known as Harondor, meaning South Gondor, as if it were part of the kingdom proper, although hitherto the White Throne had exercised no writ there. It was a fertile, temperate land which contained many fine harbors and anchorages, but Umbar had always coveted it, something which the various kings of Gondor had done little to contest. In the final years of Siriondil's rule, however, as the clouds of war steadily blackened, Tarannon scouted these coasts most studiously, taking careful note of the weak points and vulnerabilities of each port's defenses. Then, once Umbar breached the truce with Gondor in 820, the prince personally engaged many Umbarjan corsair fleets. Defeating them often, and learning their tactics and abilities well, Tarannon was handily aided in this by his brother Tarkirion, 10 years younger than he, and an equally gifted admiral. Indeed, some in the realm placed the latter's skill above the former's, for Tarkirion lacked his brother's impetuosity. But there was always a limitation to what Tarannon could achieve, since Gondor still possessed no standing royal navy with which to defy Umbar's massive reaving fleets. Hence the raids continued, with much loss to the Seven Heartlands, in spite of her prince's efforts. Once king, however, Tarannon went about changing all that. In fact, he was to be the first of a series of Gondorian monarchs to exploit the advantages of the sea to add to the growing strength and power of the Stoneland. With all due urgency, the shipyards in Pelargir, Linhir, Ethelond, Dol Mirathas, and Callambel were enlarged and began to ring with the sound of mallets and nails. Often the king himself would participate in these labors alongside his workers, setting aside his royal regalia for the purpose. Progress was rapid, and within only a few years, Gondor had the beginnings of an imposing navy. The vessels were long and sheer, with many high decks, and with masts hewn from the finest and strongest oaks from Anfalas and Ithilien, and the vast sails were emblazoned with the emblem of the white tree. In 3 years, some 100 or so of these crafts had been completed. In another 3, that number had doubled. By 836, Tarannon had his navy, and he duly put it to work clearing the Gondorian coasts of the brigands that had plagued them now for 16 miserable years. The Embardrum, caught off guard by the vigor of Gondor's defense, and not used to having to fight on equal terms with a determined adversary at sea, were driven back steadily. Dozens of enemy vessels were captured, burned, and sunk, oftentimes under the personal command of Tarannon or his brother. By 840, all the coasts and ports of the northern half of the bay were secure, and Gondor was free of the menace of Umbar once more. It would be some 6 centuries before it returned. Yet Tarannon wasn't done yet, not by a league. He had seen the efficacy of his navy against the corsairs, and saw no reason why he should settle for simply what he had earlier possessed, and so went on the offensive. In 843, he launched a series of sea attacks on the coastal towns of Harondor, south of the mouth of the Anduin, whilst a second army was marched across the river to invade the region from the landward side. Umbar, still reeling from her recent pummeling at the hands of Gondor's newfound naval might, could do nothing for the moment. There was some paltry resistance on the part of the local population, but none stood much of a chance before the forces brought to bear, and by 845 the flag of the White Tree could be seen flying along the entire coast of the river Harnen. To the north and west, too, Gondorian power was expanding. Across the Lefnui River from Anfalas, the westernmost of the Seven Heartlands, sat the region known to the Gondorians as Andrast, the native land of Ulwin the Healer, savior of the life of Romendikil after his near-fatal wounding at the Battle of Mgrimbas. It occupied the uttermost western edge of the Bay of Belfalas, as well as the western spur of the White Mountains. Andrast was a sparsely inhabited land, but a beautiful and verdant one that had hitherto given Gondor no trouble. In 846, however, a minor Andrasi lordling became involved in a dispute of some sort with the Crondir of neighboring Anfalas, and rashly led a small party of men across the Lefnui to press the point. It was a foolish move, for not only was the lord soundly thrashed, but King Tarannon, wishing to have no distractions on his western flank, sent Prince Tarkirion at the head of a large army to return the favor with an invasion of Andrast. In 2 swift campaigns this was accomplished without much trouble, and by the close of the year 850, all of Andrast owned Tarannon as her lord. Save for Umbar herself, the entire Bay of Belfalas was now under the power of Gondor. Such a state of things had never been seen before, for the White Throne now controlled portions of territory here and there that even Numenor had never laid claim to, and there could now be no doubt of Gondor's succession of that land as the greatest king of men in Middle-earth. Naturally, following these acquisitions, Tarannon's fame and prestige reached a new peak, and the lords and peoples of the realm scrambled to heap upon him all manner of honors. He was called the Great Ship King, Corsair's Bane, and the Scourge of the Waves. But it was the master of Ethelond who hailed the king by the title most commonly associated with him. He named him Falastur, which translates to the Lord of the Coasts, and it is as Tarannon Falastur that he is best remembered by history. Umbar did not accept her defeat lightly, to be sure, and for 15 years more after the conquest of Harandor, Tarannon Falastur had to fight off various attempts to recapture the region. The corsairs might actually have stood a fighting chance of dislodging Gondor had they been united, but as it happened, the city-state of Umbar herself was swiftly descending into political chaos, thus keeping her full strength from being levied against the garrisons of Harandor. In 855, an especially determined attack was made on a sizable Gondorian fleet anchored at the mouth of the Kellamar, a small rivulet about 100 leagues north of the Harnen. The corsairs were defeated and scattered once again, but Tarannon's great flagship, the Ekmeril, was lit aflame and sunk, much to the king's consternation. Tarannon had his share of distractions at home as well. Several of the commanders put in place to oversee Gondor's new lands in the west and south in many cases proceeded to treat their charges with light-fingered chicanery, and used them as opportunities to enrich themselves at the expense of the royal treasury, obliging the king to spend many months sorting out the offenders. This had the effect of tarnishing his golden image somewhat among the soldiers and officers of the ranks. More pernicious still was the situation to the north, in Arnor. Since King Elendil had made his request for aid from Siriondil a century before, affairs had only continued to deteriorate, with perpetual squabbles among Arnor's dependencies over precedence and land rights. Inflaming the situation further were family disputes. Elendil's son and successor, Erendur, had 3 sons. Amlaeth, the eldest, was apparently born of a union of dubious legitimacy, and his younger brothers were loath to do obeisance to him, or to recognize his legitimacy as heir to the Arnorian throne. Poor Erendur desperately tried to bring about some reconciliation between his sons, but to little avail. Therefore he guessed civil war would not be far off preceding his death. To prevent this, in 855, he renewed his father's plea for military assistance from the South Kingdom, so that in the event of such a conflict, some central government might be maintained by force of arms. Tarannon, unfortunately, was still embroiled with his wars with Umbar. 855 was the year of the Battle of the Kellamar, and the king needed every soldier he could muster to hold on to his garrisons in Harandor. Therefore, when he received Erendur's emissaries in Pelargir, although sympathetic to his kinsman's troubles, there was little he could do for the moment. For the second time, promises of assistance and aid were made, but nothing more. The envoys returned to Arnor empty-handed, and with nothing but the hope that the king of Gondor would make good on his word in due time. A few years later, the opportunity seemed to arrive when in 860, exhausted from nearly a quarter-century of war, Umbar finally sued for peace and brokered a treaty with the king, in which she acknowledged the overlordship of Gondor over Harandor and all its tributaries. To cement this peace, Tarannon took an unprecedented step. In 857, his queen, Eilonil, had died of illness. The union had been arranged by Tarannon's father Siriondil, and had not been happy. The pair had remained childless. Her premature death, however, presented him with an opportunity to solve 2 problems at once. He needed both an heir to his throne and a means of ensuring Umbar's good faith. Therefore, as part of the treaty, he took to wife a certain Beruthiel, a daughter of one of Umbar's oldest noble houses. Many stories are told of Beruthiel. She was said to be quite beautiful and seductive, to have trained cats to spy for her, and to be learned in the mystic arts of herbology, alchemy, and sorcery. How much of this is so is subject to conjecture. However, it is quite certain that Tarannon was pleased, at least at first, with the marriage, and viewed it as the crowning vestment of a lifetime of efforts. Both the common people and the priesthood, however, were less pleased. No king of Gondor had ever taken a foreign wife before, and though strictly speaking Beruthiel was of high Númenorian descent, the notion of an Umbardrum princess sitting enthroned in Osgiliath gave disquiet to many in the land. Clemon, the Einitar, was especially vocal in his objection to the union, something Tarannon did not forget, as were many of the great landed nobles, who looked askance at the queen's antecedents. These ill feelings would only grow in time. Almost as if to cast a pall of ill omen over the affair, in the spring of 861, about a year after Tarannon and Beruthiel's marriage, came the news of King Erendir's death, and the outbreak of civil war in Arnor. Erendir's 3 sons had each claimed the crown for themselves, and the country was effectively sundered into 3 territories between the claimants, with none being possessed of sufficient strength to overcome the others. This effectively marked the end of the northern kingdom of Arnor, 9.5 centuries after her foundation by Elendil the Tall. Anuminus would be ravaged by the desecrations of the civil war, and would eventually fall into dereliction and ruin in favor of other strongholds, as it was no longer strategically positioned. It was altogether a bitter and tragic end to a land which had once rivaled Gondor herself among the realms of men in Middle-earth. Tarannon, having missed his chance to forestall the North's collapse, did what he could by declaring his non-favoritism and sending emissaries to the courts of the 3 warring kinglets, so as to hopefully ensure that Gondor would come out the winner regardless of which emerged victorious. At home, meanwhile, Tarannon Falastur's reign proceeded quietly enough, for a while. In 867 he was presented with the chance to remove an albatross from around the crown's neck, when the Einitar Clemon died. The latter had been a near constant thorn in both Tarannon's and his father's side throughout through his opposing of their marriages to Dernedel and Beruthiel, respectively. He siphoned off money and treasury from the populace in the form of tribute for his favor as the voice of the Valar, and he had the irksome habit of interfering in certain matters of state, when it suited him and his acolytes on Cair Andros to do so. Following his death, Tarannon Falastur was determined to be done forever with both the temple and its troublesome high priest. In his May of 867 he declared the temple, as well as the office of Einitar, abolished, and had the temple treasures of Cair Andros relocated to Minas Anor. Henceforth he proclaimed that he would act as both king and high priest to Gondor's peoples, for the betterment of the realm, and to safeguard its wealth and bounty from the incubus of clerical corruption and greed. To be sure, Clemon had left behind a son, Thurgelion, who was proclaimed by some as the successor to the swan chair, but he himself never asserted his claim, thinking it better not to incur the king's wrath. Nevertheless, he is considered by certain scribes as the last of the Ainatari, as he left no children. It was a bold move indeed, and only Tarannon's glamour and prestige as the bane of the corsairs and humbler of Umbar allowed him to make it without provoking massive demonstrations among the people. After 9 centuries the temple was no more, and never again would a cleric be able to waggle his finger before the royal nose, as Oronir had done to Atanatar, Colthalion had done to Siriondel, or Clemon to Tarannon. And so the king's power emerged from the 860s even greater than before. There followed an interim of a dozen or so years, during which nothing much apparently transpired to be worthy of note, save for a steady upwelling of trade along the Harnen and the coasts of Harondor and Andrast, under the security of Tarannon's mastery over the Bay of Belfalas. However, by 880 there were darkling clouds on the horizon. For one thing, as the years passed with no children being produced by the king and queen, the feelings of affection between Tarannon and Beruthiel steadily cooled. The two spent more and more time apart, until by the time 25 years had passed since their union, they saw each other only on state occasions. The king's brother and heir, Tarkirion, did not evidently either like or trust his sister-in-law, and did much to sway his brother against her. Gradually more and more of his captains did the same, as Umbar slowly began drawing plans against Gondor to renew the war and reclaim her lost possessions. In 889, a number of ships that had been quietly sequestered on the Harnen, much to the strategic disadvantage of Umbar, were set upon and burned. Whether this was done through the agency of spies or simple luck on the part of the corsairs cannot be known with certainty, but the blame for it was laid squarely on the Queen by Tarannon's commanders and ministers. They maintained that, far from loving the king or his people, that she had come to Gondor specifically to act as a spy for her people to the south, and had been supplying her kinsmen with knowledge concerning the placement of Gondorian troops and supplies for years, for nothing else could surely explain such an inexplicable turn of good fortune for the corsairs. Tarannon might well have believed this. Or perhaps he had simply grown impatient with his queen for not performing her wifely duties and providing him with lawful heirs. Whatever his reasons, in 890 he declared their marriage dissolved, and by the close of the year Beruthiel had left Gondor. The common story is that Tarannon had her placed in one of his great ships, along with the cats, which supposedly acted as her familiars, and set her adrift from Pelargir, with neither crew nor servants. The more likely and less dramatic version of events, however, is that he simply allowed her to sail back to Umbar under royal escort. The repudiation of the marriage to Beruthiel, of course, meant a renewal of the war with Umbar, and the latter lost no time in unleashing fresh raids on the ports of Harandor and Lebanon. In 894 they even attempted to besiege Pelargir. Fortunately for Gondor, her navy and garrisons were well seasoned by now, and proved a more than adequate defense, and Tarkirion led effective counterattacks against all these incursions. Gondor retained her provinces without much difficulty. So well, in fact, did Gondorian naval power acquit itself, that in 899 Tarannon felt secure enough to elevate Andras to the rank of a full province, complete with a demivir governing in the king's name. The final years of Tarannon's reign were dreary ones. In 903, his faithful brother, right hand and heir, Tarkirion, was slain in a skirmish with a small Umbardrum force off the coast of Harandor, after over 70 years of working together with his older sibling to bring both Umbar and the Bay of Belfalas to heel. His tragic end plunged the king into a deep mourning. He found some relief in matrimony when, in 907, in desperation to produce an heir, he took the unheralded step of wedding for a third time to a noble lady of Pelargiri stock named Valathrel. To the surprise of no one, the union bore no fruit, though the king remained devoted to his fair young queen. She was his one comfort in the twilight seasons of his life. Not even the introduction to the realm of yet another province, the reach of land stretching from Andrast to the southern bank of the Angren River, called Druwaith in 910, could lift the royal spirits. In truth, by this time the king had become a tired, careworn shadow of the vivacious prince he had once been. Tarannon Falastur finally succumbed to death in Narvinje of 913, after a reign of 83 years, during which time he had worked almost tirelessly, and almost always successfully, to increase Gondor's strength and power. In so doing, he had proven himself to be the most remarkable king since Isildur and Anarion. Indeed, none of his lines stand taller in the pages of most histories. Few who sat the white throne before him had equaled his sheer driving energy and ambition. None shared his resources and skill of hand and mind. By his expansion of Gondor's territories, the augmentation of her navies, and the abolition of the temple, he left a shadow upon the history of the Seven Heartlands from which it was never to completely emerge. Yet for all his gifts, Tarannon's death presented Gondor with an unlooked-for dilemma. Since Meneldiel, 10 kings had sat the White Throne in Osgiliath over a period of some 9 centuries. Some had been of greater or lesser merit and ability, but all had left a son behind to succeed them upon their death. Tarannon Falastur, however, failed to do this, and with his passing came an end also to the line of Meneldil. The Shaping of Gondor, Part 2. The Line of Meneldil. Chapter 3. Lords and Priests. From Duvakil's submission to Turambar in 568 until the final 10 years of the reign of the latter's grandson Siriondil were 250 years of relative peace, both at home and beyond the borders of the realm. One might almost call it a renewal of the Spring of Gondor, but for two things about the era: the characters of the men who sat the throne during that time, and the particularly bitter and fractious nature of the quarrels they took part in. Many of these were the residue of the 4.5 centuries preceding the Easterling invasion, mementos of the troubles swept under the rug by the East Victor's quiescent predecessors. The two great points at issue were, whom was to be supreme in the kingdom in terms of law, and whom was to be her chief shepherd in spirit. The obeisance of Pelargir had made the first question moot, in name anyway, but that had been 7 centuries earlier, when memories of Sauron and Numenor were still fresh. Now, with no such looming threat, the long usage of provincial power and title, particularly